Have you ever wanted to do 120 damage on turn 2 consistently? Have you ever wanted to draw 8 to 10 cards in a turn and draw through your entire deck by turn 5 or 6? Have you ever wanted to play EX cards and not have to worry about Oricorio? That is what this deck is for. This is why you should be playing Solgaleo Sylveon. The main goal of this deck is just to get Solgaleo online as fast as possible, doing 120 damage per turn. This is very difficult for pretty much any deck to deal with. As a side effect of this, you get to draw tons of cards with Sylveon, Professor's Research, and Pokeball. And you use cards like Magearna and Guzma to deal with all of the annoying matchups that you may not have a lot of play against. So let's just start from the top. Solgaleo, 180 HP, does 120 damage per turn. Gets to come in for free with its ability, and does 120 damage for only 2 energies, with the very slight downside of doing 10 damage to itself. It also usually doesn't have to worry about fire being its weakness, and has a pretty normal retreat cost of only 2. One of the best parts about Solgaleo is that it one-shots Sylveon because Sylveon has a weakness to steel, so Solgaleo is perfectly positioned in a Sylveon-infested meta. It also has the benefit of Cosmog as its basic, with a pretty standard 60 HP, and an ability that can protect itself in a pinch. It also has the interesting side effect of having a different weakness than Solgaleo, which sometimes plays to your advantage. Next, Sylveon. The crazy thing is, we only run steel energies in this deck, so Sylveon can't even ever attack. But, let's be honest, the attack is pretty mediocre. The best part of Sylveon is its ability, letting you draw 2 cards when it comes into play. It also has a pretty respectable 140 HP, which is very important for this deck, because sometimes you will end up using Sylveon as a tank in order to buy time to set up your Solgaleo. Eevee is also passable, again 60 HP, and its attack lets you draw a card, which is pretty much the only thing you'll want to be doing if you have Eevee in the active spot to begin with. Last we have Magearna, which might seem like a strange choice, considering it's a pretty rare card in this meta, but we have the advantage of running steel energies in this deck, which gives us access to Magearna, which is the best Oricorio counter in the game. 90 HP on a basic, and it does 80 damage for 2 energy to Pokemon that have an ability. And while Oricorio is your #1 target for this, a lot of good cards in this meta do have abilities. Think of Darkrai and Giratina, think of Greninja, think of Zeraora, Celesteela, and Magearna also has a very reasonable 1 retreat cost. Okay, so let's go to the trainers. First off, Professor Oak and Pokeball. Obviously, these cards are good in any deck, which is why they're in almost every deck, but in this deck in particular, they really shine. Sylveon and sometimes Eevee give you a lot of card draw without having to use trainers, which means you can play a Sylveon, it can hit a Professor Oak, you can play the Professor Oak, it can hit 2 Pokeballs, you can use both the Pokeballs, which takes 2 more cards out of your deck, and by the end of this whole process, half of your deck is gone, and you already have all the cards you need to win the game. All the cards in this deck really serve a purpose and are good, but none shine more than Sabrina. This, paired with Magearna, really gives you a lot of play against Oricorio. If Magearna kills 1 Oricorio and then it dies, you still have a game plan, because you can use Sabrina to send Oricorio to the bench and then kill almost any Pokemon that they're going to send back out with Solgaleo. And of course, many decks have trouble having more than 2 cards that can take 120 damage twice in a row. And this is the whole reason why you don't need Cyrus in this deck. It's usually not that important to pull a specific card from someone's bench when you're already doing 120 damage to something. If that thing retreats, it's very unlikely that you'll do 120 damage to their active Pokemon. They'll retreat it, and then the Pokemon that they send out into the active slot and the other cards on their bench will all be able to take more than 120 damage for 2 turns in a row. It does happen, but it's very rare. It's very common for this deck's final turn to be using Sabrina to switch in something to kill the Solgaleo. Okay, next we have the Solgaleo support package, you might call it. That's Lillie, Rare Candy, and Leftovers. Obviously, Rare Candy is important because we are skipping straight over the stage 1 and going straight from Cosmog to Solgaleo. Leftovers just lets you compensate for the 10 damage per turn that you're going to be chipping yourself with when you play Solgaleo and use Soulbreaker. And Lillie is really what lets you crush some of the weaker decks in the format. If they aren't trying to kill you in 2 hits, then Lillie is going to be what shores up your HP. And Guzma actually kind of falls into that same bucket. If someone's trying to get out of a breakpoint with a cape, or they're trying to use Rocky Helm to chip you down, or use Poison Barb in some of these cheesy poison decks, then Guzma can take care of that. Okay, and that's all the cards for this deck. So let's just go over your basic game plan. Perhaps obviously, you just want Solgaleo as fast as possible. This means that oftentimes, even if it seems like you don't have a hope of getting Solgaleo out, you still should play to the possibility of that happening. So let's say you start with Eevee in your active slot and Cosmog on your bench, and no Rare Candy and no Solgaleo, you should still put your first energy on Cosmog, because it's very likely that if you already have a Professor Oak, or if you draw into a Sylveon, that will lead to a chain of drawing cards that will end up giving you Solgaleo by turn 2 with 2 energies. And keep in mind, you don't have to even worry about retreating Eevee or retreating Sylveon, because Solgaleo can always bring itself into the active slot with Rising Road. Of course, if you need to, Sylveon makes a passable tank. It can usually take a hit or two, depending on the deck you're playing against, and sometimes you may even need to juggle Sylveons back and forth, just to make sure that you don't die before you get your Solgaleo online. But I would say this is actually a relatively uncommon occurrence, because there's so much card draw in this deck that you get Solgaleo online very quickly, more often than not. And then obviously once you have Solgaleo online, you want to back it up with Leftovers and Lillie, and you want to crush your opponents with Sabrina. Plan B is using Magearna. Now, Magearna is usually just a backup option, like if your opponents are playing Oricorio, or if you end up needing to do a Plan B in a situation where your opponents are playing Darkrai or Giratina or Greninja, or sometimes Magearna just ends up being the only option because you get a little bit unlucky. And that perfectly segues us into the drawbacks of this deck. One of those being Magearna only opening hands. This is when this deck is at its roughest. Obviously, it's nice that Magearna has 90 HP to start with, and it's nice that you still can attack with it if you get to turn 2 and you still don't have the Solgaleo online. But to be honest, putting energies on Magearna when you're not playing against Oricorio is generally not where you want to be. And of course, that leads to another main problem with this deck, which is it basically has one game plan: get Solgaleo online as fast as possible. If you can't do that, if you get extremely unlucky, well, then you basically don't do anything. Sylveon can't attack, and it's kind of a liability if it takes more than 2 hits. And Magearna has a little bit of play, but it's generally not good enough to compete by itself against really any deck. And while Sylveon does make it much easier to get your Solgaleo game plan online, it has some drawbacks. First, obviously, like I said, it can't attack. Second, it takes up a lot of bench space. If you'll notice, you have a total of 5 basic Pokemon in this deck. If you end up with a Magearna early against a deck that you don't want to play it against, sometimes it's tempting to play it anyway because you're afraid of having no play at all. Sometimes it's difficult to juggle Cosmog, Eevee, and Magearna. And while Sylveon is great because it draws you 2 cards and it can tank, what this means is sometimes if you play Magearna, you're sacrificing playing either a Cosmog or an Eevee, and you can end up in situations where you wish you could play the Sylveon in your hand but you don't have space to play an Eevee, or you wish you could set up another Solgaleo but you don't have space to play a Cosmog. Another weakness of Sylveon is, while it is a decent tank that draws cards, this means that if you pull it to your bench with Solgaleo's Rising Road, your opponent has 2 points just waiting on your bench for Cyrus. So Cyrus can be a real problem to play against. But I mean, Cyrus is good against pretty much every deck, so it's not unique to this deck. I'd say the final weakness is that sometimes this deck does run out of steam. So much of your deck is dedicated to drawing cards that when you have all your cards drawn that you need, you don't actually have a lot of play if Solgaleo and Sabrina don't do the trick. Sometimes you end up drawing most of your deck, and all the cards left in your hand just draw cards. Of course, that situation is rare, which is why I think this deck is so good, but it does happen. And those are the only real drawbacks with this deck I can think of. It seems like in major tournaments right now, there's pretty much only about 4% of people are playing this deck, despite it doing pretty well, and despite it seeming extremely powerful to pilot. I honestly think this deck is easy mode to Masterball. If you think I missed anything about the strengths or weaknesses of this deck, or if you have any alternate versions or modifications, or ways to play against this deck, or ways to play this deck against other decks, let me know in the comments.